Hello and welcome to the Unit 2 overview for Geography 102. In the first half of Unit 2, we're going to look at the Americas. We're going to look at North America first, and then we're going to look at Middle and South America. In the second half of Unit 2, we're going to shift gears. We're going to cross the Atlantic and look at Sub-Saharan Africa, and also Southwest Asia and North Africa. So to begin with our look at North America, a couple of the key concepts that are going to carry through this unit are going to be to look at economic specialization. And as we'll note in Unit 2, economic growth and evolution coincides heavily with urbanization. So while we see our economies shift, our economies evolve, our economies modernize, we're also going to see a movement of people into our cities. With North America, we're going to look at our historic patterns. We're going to see how industry, agriculture, and slavery helped create these regional identities and these regional economies. We'll spend a significant time focusing on slavery and see how, while slavery was focused in the South, both the exploitation of free labor positively impacted the economies of both the North and the South. So it's not as simple as saying this was a Southern issue. When we look at the economic history of America, we see the economic benefit from this exploitative system. So that'll be an area of concentration and see as we moved away from slavery how our economies evolved. So we should be able to identify some of the historic patterns in North America, including the region we're in now for school, the Maryland and Virginia region, the reliance on cash crops like tobacco. We're going to then focus on the Industrial Revolution, and we can't overlook how this transformed our population centers. The Industrial Revolution, the growth of industry and manufacturing in North America, shifted our populations from rural areas into our cities and also served as a significant pull factor for immigration. In Unit 1, we looked at immigration and discussed push and pull factors. We're going to see how the Industrial Revolution in North America created that strong pull factor. And from the late 1800s through 2020, we're seeing how industry and economic growth continues to serve as that pull factor for immigrants overseas and also migrants within our country. So some of the patterns that were established in the 19th century persist today. We're going to look at the role of deindustrialization and globalization. So while our country industrialized for over a century, we hit a global shift beginning around 1970, a topic that was introduced in Unit 1, globalization, the increased interconnection and interdependence among people, places, and institutions around the world. We see how deindustrialization played a significant role in this, how we shifted a lot of our manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, textiles, semi-skilled manufacturing overseas or to other countries, and how this deindustrialization in the United States triggered a new economy. So over the last 50 years, we've seen a shift away from heavy industry and more into the service sector, the tertiary and quaternary sectors as they're known. And we introduce another reading that coincides with a topic introduced by Finlayson, and that's the idea of gentrification. So gentrification is an important topic when we look at urban geography. And gentrification, in this case, looks at the social and physical transformation of communities as outsiders of a higher social class move in. Within the look at gentrification, we use a historical writing by an author, Holcomb, and Holcomb discusses the what, where, why, and who of gentrification. And then towards the end of the lecture slides, I incorporate two different views of people living in gentrifying neighborhoods, people that were longtime residents. And one of the authors looks at gentrification in a positive way, as a way to promote economic activity and development, and also create more social integration, integrating different races, ethnicities, and economic classes. While another author talks about how she's priced out of her home community, how this rapid physical transformation and economic growth and increasing cost of living created a scenario where she's no longer able to afford to live in the neighborhood where she grew up. So gentrification is a very complex issue. It's an issue that many of you may encounter today or may encounter upon graduation if you currently or plan to live in cities. The next chapter looks at Middle and South America, and Finlayson does a nice job focusing on some of the empires and civilizations that existed in what's known as the pre-Columbian era, prior to 1492, when European colonizers really created a footprint in this area. So you'll learn about the Aztecs and the Mayans and see how they established different areas of Middle and South America. We'll also take a look at the important role of colonialism. And colonialism, again, another complex issue. And in this case, we're going to look at it in how the mainland evolved relative to the rimland. The mainland being the areas of Middle and South America that are on the continents, and the rimland pertaining heavily to the Caribbean. And we'll see how areas of the mainland were established by the colonizers and used to promote the growth of those colonial families, where the rimland was more of an area of exploitation, an area where you could extract materials for international trade. And the idea that the mainland was owned and operated by the colonizers, the rimland used labor, most oftentimes forced labor, to extract and exploit the natural resources. In the second part of this chapter on Middle and South America, we're going to take another look at urbanization, and we're going to see how the inequalities are really magnified in Middle and South America. What are known as primate cities will be introduced. Primate cities are disproportionately larger and more economically important than all other cities in a country. So when we look at places like Brazil and Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City in Mexico, Caracas, Venezuela, we see these primate city attributes. And we'll also see we'll also take our first look at slums and see how rapid urbanization across the developing world is leading to the rapid growth of slums. So slums will be introduced in this chapter on Middle and South America, and then will be reintroduced when we look at Sub-Saharan Africa. The reading by Short introduces 5 key trends in urbanization today in what's known as the third urban revolution. This third urban revolution coincides with deindustrialization and globalization that began in 1970. So what's going on now in our cities, not only in the United States but around the world, is rapid change. Cities are growing fast, they're growing rapidly, particularly in developing countries. We're seeing the increase in megacities, which is a city with a population of 10 million or more. We're seeing the growth of metropolitanization, which means that cities in different countries are becoming increasingly linked through economics, through transportation, through populations. So when we look at the United States, we have an area called megalopolis, which looks at just north of Boston, Massachusetts, going down to Richmond, Virginia. And we see how this area, this metropolitan expanse, is really increasingly connected more and more each year. We see other megalopolis structures exist in places like China. So we're not alone in this metropolitanization factor. And we'll take a look at sprawl, and we'll take another look at slums. And we'll introduce the idea of over-urbanization, which occurs when cities' populations grow so rapidly that the formal job market and formal housing market can't accommodate the population change. And we'll take our first peek at this concept of System D, which I think you'll find interesting. The third chapter in Unit 2 looks at Sub-Saharan Africa. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to introduce our pre-colonial empires. We'll see how groups like the Muslims were on the scene before the European colonizers, and we'll look at some of the tribal communities that existed before the Islamic caravans and the Islamic diffusion spread into Africa. Then we'll focus on a really important event, which was known as the Berlin Conference in 1884. And the Berlin Conference was a time when colonial powers came together in Europe, and they decided, obviously without the permission of the people living there, that they were going to divvy up Africa. They were going to create their own territories, regardless of historic ancestral claims, regardless of what the people on the ground thought. And by divvying up Africa, this race for Africa, they were looking to exploit and extract natural resources. We're going to see how this establishment of colonialism and this look at exploitation and extraction is carried into the 21st century. So there was little investment back into sub-Saharan Africa. The wealth and the extraction and the riches and the profits were all brought back into Western Europe. In the 20th century, the colonial system collapsed and the countries in sub-Saharan Africa gained independence. And what we're seeing, even a couple generations later, is some of the turbulence and instability associated with colonialism, as many of the political boundaries that are in place today don't coincide again with historic claims, with different ethnic groups, with different tribal groups that have had long time claims to these areas. And we also see that economically, a lot of these new independent countries exist in what's called a neo-colonial setup, where many of them are still extracting and shipping their goods overseas and shipping them back to their former colonial oppressors or their former colonial countries, and a lot of the benefit is still going back to the former colonial places. So when we see this type of natural resource extraction today, oftentimes the benefit doesn't go back into the newly independent country. Within sub-Saharan Africa, we see the persistent trend of rapid urbanization and population growth. And the growth of slums is also occurring in places like Nigeria. The slum of Makoko is one of the largest slums in the world. In East Africa, we have the slum of Kibera. These different slums will be introduced in the second half of the lecture on Sub-Saharan Africa and System D. And I think you'll find interesting the TED Talk on System D. System D is the name for the informal economy that evolves when over-urbanization occurs and the formal economy can no longer accommodate formal job opportunities for the rapidly growing population. And then we're going to wrap up our look at Unit 2 by examining North Africa and Southeast Asia. Most importantly, in this or a big focus in this chapter will be religion. And we're going to talk about the Semitic and Abrahamic religions. We're going to focus a lot of our attention on the 5 pillars of Islam in the Old City of Jerusalem. So the Semitic or Abrahamic religions, we often identify with Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, makes up about 4 billion followers worldwide. So over half of the people on earth are part of the Islamic faith or Christianity. And we're going to see some of the history of these religions and also how these religions help influence our day-to-day life and culture, particularly through the 5 pillars of Islam. And then we'll take a look at Old City Jerusalem, a small walled city that is highly contested. The Old City of Jerusalem is different quarters. It has a Muslim quarter, an Armenian quarter, a Christian quarter, and a Jewish quarter. And we'll see how these different quarters persist and exist in close confines with one another. And then we'll look at the role of natural resource wealth and political instability in some of the countries in this region. Many of these regions are guided by what are called theocracies, where the heads of state are not only political figures, but also religious figures. So we'll touch on, again, the Americas in the first half of Unit 2, and then we'll shift gears and go into Africa and Southwest Asia in the second part of Unit 2. One of the important themes that goes through the first 3 chapters of this unit will be urbanization. So I think you'll identify a lot of similarities as far as the pull of urbanization and how urbanization and industrialization and economic growth go together. Another big subtopic then will be religion. So as we go through these different regions, again, urbanization will be important as a subtopic, and then in the 4th chapter on North Africa and Southwest Asia, religion will be our key subtopic. So as you go through, again, these are some of the highlights of the unit. If you have any questions, let me know, and otherwise I will talk to you soon.